Thank you very much for having me here and for the work that the Society does. I'm going to talk mostly about the Goldsmith Lake Wilderness Area, both for itself and as an example of what a group of citizens can do in trying to protect an area. But I'm going to start with our overall campaign. And I'm going to be focused at the beginning on Annapolis County, but the Save Our Old Forest campaign has now spread. I think we've got petitions going in half of the counties of the province, including Halifax County. So if you haven't signed it yet, there's a petition there. And if you're up for collecting signatures, take one of those sheets. There's an address to send it to at the bottom. So Save Our Old Forests, this campaign grew in large part out of the feeling of just desperation and frustration at what's happening to the planet and watching both the crisis of climate, but also of biodiversity loss, of nature loss, and trying to think of something that we can do. And a really obvious starting place in Nova Scotia, and in fact, many places of the world, is really to try and protect forests, and particularly to try and protect the old forests. So this grew out of a conjunction of the Arlington Forest Protection Society, which is a small nonprofit in Annapolis County, and a rather grandly named but really quite loose and ragged group called the Citizen Scientists of Southwest Nova Scotia, because I had to come up with a name. And that, by the way, is a Blackburnian warbler, for those who don't know, and it's one of the species of birds dependent on old forests. And it has had the most catastrophic decline of all of the old species in Nova Scotia. Between 1985 and 2020, it's had a 70% decline in its population. And that study reveals very clearly that that's linked to the loss of old forest habitat. So the loss of habitat. I think many of you know that there's been a tremendous amount of clear cutting, in particular over the last 30 years. This is from Global Forest Watch. It's a satellite map showing forest cover loss in Annapolis County in 2001. That's the pink patches. Many of those will grow back as young forest, but it's loss of forest, and it's often loss of old forest. Over the course of the next 21 years, this is what happened. Yeah. So when we're talking about the need to protect old forests, there's just not that much left. And I looked at the similar map for Halifax County, and it's pretty much the same when you go to the eastern half of the province, of the county. So when you see something like this, there's two things happening with that clear cutting. One is forest degradation, meaning the forests have become younger and simpler and support less biodiversity. And the other thing is habitat fragmentation, which is one of the major causes for biodiversity loss. And you look at this and you can see that it's basically been chopped to heck. And how something like the mainland moose would travel through that landscape is a real question. So when we're talking about protecting, we're really talking about protecting old forests, but also trying to put together contiguous areas, even if they include some younger forest, so that you start to have patches that are beginning to recover and already have some level of biodiversity, seed trees on a species base. So the good news, the PCs ran on a promise of protecting 20%. They outstripped the Liberals, who were promising 17%. They obviously both knew that people actually care about this. And to their credit, when the PCs came in, they put that electoral pledge into legislation. Unfortunately, they've done not very much at all since then. So there's the commitment. At the moment, we have Nova Scotia has about 13% of land and water protected, which is actually better than any other maritime province. There's about another 1% that sort of in the queue has already pretty much been approved for protection, but has been sitting there for a very long time It should be easy pickings, but it's just wending its way remarkably slowly. And none of this seems to have grasped the urgency of the crisis that we're facing. But the remaining 6% to get us to that 20% is quite substantial. It's 330,000 hectares. That's the equivalent of 3 tobeatic wildernesses. It's a lot of land. If it's protected, it'll move another, if it all comes from Crown land, and most of it will, just for financial reasons, it will move another 18% of Crown land into protection. So it's a very important goal. It's modest compared to the global biodiversity framework that was signed in Montreal last December, where 186 countries pledged to protect 30% by 2030. So it's not a crazy goal. It's a moderate one that the government has made a legal commitment to, and we really need to hold them to that. So one of the questions is, well, what are you going to protect? So which forests should we protect? Basically, we need to protect the oldest forests that we can, for the very simple reason that forests take a long time to develop lots and lots of different habitats. And there's really no substitute for 100 years. You can't make it happen quicker. So a complex forest with lots of nooks and crannies, otherwise known as microhabitats, is going to be able to support many more forms of life than a young, simple forest. In Nova Scotia, people tend to, I noticed when I say old forest, they go, old growth. And that's actually not what we're talking about. For one, well, there are a couple of reasons, but the main one is in the latest iteration of the Nova Scotia's old growth forest policy, all old growth forest on Crown land is afforded protection as soon as DNRR recognizes it as old growth. That is a bit of a proviso, which we'll get to later. But basically, if it's recognized as old growth, it is given what's called policy protection. It's not quite as good as wilderness area protection, but it's basically solid protection. So what we're more focused on is the forest that's going to become old growth if you leave it alone for 40 years. So basically, we're saying forests over 80 years, and that's a threshold that DNRR, the Department of Natural Resources and Renewables, also uses. So how much of that 80-year-old forest do we have left? The old growth, under 1%, but 80-year-old forests, there's some discussion. This is using Nova Scotia's forest inventory statistics. This isn't an environmental group that came up with this. And according to those statistics, as you see, in 1958, a quarter of Nova Scotia's forests were over 80. By the time you get to 2003, that figure was 1.5%. So we really truly don't have good statistics. DNRR has lately come out saying, oh, no, there's way more than that. So much more that almost anybody who knows their way around the woods here is going, I don't think so, including people within the Department of Environment. So might it be as much as 20% of our forests? Maybe. It's probably not that many. But however you look at it, if we're going to protect 20% of lands and waters, and a pretty good chunk of that should be old forest, we pretty much need to protect the old forest that's on Crown land. We probably aren't going to be able to do that on private land, and in Nova Scotia, only a third of the forests are Crown, are public land. 2/3 are in private hands. Some of those are small woodlot owners who look after them, and about half are big industrial forestry concerns that are pretty deeply devoted to clear cutting. So what happens on the public lands is very important. Unfortunately, while the government has made this pledge, they're also quite busy approving plans to log the old forests. So this is an example drawn pretty much in the center of that ravaged by clear-cut image I gave you of Annapolis County. And this is actually that sort of wishbone-shaped lake in there. It's Goldsmith Lake, and it was a lake that quite a lot of people who care about nature had been keeping an eye on, because we knew that it was quite special in a number of ways that I'll come back to. But it was also an area that had not yet been chopped up quite so badly. So we were pretty horrified when we saw this plan, because the plan is to log about over 1,000 acres around. I should say the logging proposed is not clear cutting. This is thanks to the Leahy. This is the ecological matrix. However, we only take a third of the trees in the ecological matrix is turning out not to be true, because many of the prescriptions don't count the extraction trails, which take a quarter of the forest before you even start counting. So really, most of them are taking at least 50%, and at that point, you're really not doing the kind of ecological forestry that allows a forest to retain its old forest characteristic and its biodiversity. You're back to letting so much light in that you change the structure of the forest. So, yeah, we were pretty dismayed about this. And I'm going to come back to that with some more thoughts. But one of the directions that we took in just our general thinking about the state of our old forest is, how can we come up with a very clear, very simple ask that will address this issue? And this was sort of the minimal version that we came up with. This one is for Annapolis County. We also decided to go county by county, because in part the forestry industry has sort of convinced the government there's really only a few kind of radicals in Annapolis County who care about this. This is what the forestry industry tells them. So we figured if we had county after county submitting these petitions, it would be hard to peddle that line. They need to be paper petitions because that's what the legislature recognizes in Nova Scotia. And that's actually fine, because it means that people have to talk to each other. They don't sit at home and click a button. And I mean, generally politicians recognize how much work something is. You know, an email is worth a lot more than a click on a button, and a visit to an MLA is worth many more times than that, because it takes more effort. And they understand that that represents more concern on the part of their constituents. So doing things that are a bit more difficult is actually a good thing to do. So now I'm going to come back around to the Save Our Old Forest campaign and the petitions when I get to the end, and talk a little bit about what's happening outside of Annapolis County. But this is going back to that image of the clear cutting in Annapolis County. So all of those pink areas are areas that were clear cut between 2001 and 2022. And the outlines that we've drawn in there are really looking for areas that will either haven't been cut to heck yet, or are necessary stepping stones or wildlife connectivity. So the other areas that don't look as if they've been cut yet, it's because they're already protected. So that area in the top right-hand corner is Cloud Lake Wilderness. And down in the sort of lower, along the bottom is the edge of the Medway Wilderness Area. So we're really looking at how do you connect those areas, as well as how do you protect areas that have valuable old forest within them. The one that looks like a dinosaur about to eat the others is around Big Lahave Lake. The other two I've been a little more focused on. They're sort of closer in for us to get to. The one sort of at the top is Beals Brook, and that's where we had the last camp for 6 months, and where we really learned about the use of lichens. We were able to stop the logging in the area that we were focused on after we had identified enough species of risk lichens to take 60% of the cut block off the table. It was a pretty monumental effort, and we camped there from December 2nd to June 22nd. So through not this last winter, but the one before. But the one I'm going to focus on is the leftmost, and there's Goldsmith Lake within it. So after we recovered a little bit from coming home from last Turk camp, in October, we finally got ourselves organized to go out and start documenting what was there, because people had been in and out in a few places, but we hadn't really gone in any kind of concentrated ways to begin to look. And, you know, I should say this is always a funny mix. So Ginny Prue on the left is, you know, quite an authority on native plants. She's in her 80s at this point. So we had some people with a tremendous amount of knowledge. Her daughter Lisa on the right end has also a tremendous amount of knowledge of native flora and fungi and so on, but she'd also been bitten by the lichen bug and started really learning about them during COVID. So she was kind of a few steps ahead. And when we did workshops at Last Hope to start teaching people how to identify lichens, she promptly went out and found 2 more species at risk during the workshop. So that was pretty excellent. So we set off through the forest, and, you know, it was this lovely October day, and oyster mushrooms and, you know, the pleasures of being out in the woods. And then somebody noticed some extra light off to the left. And we discovered that somewhere between the time when those harvest plans had been put up for comment, and many of us had made comments and said, please don't cut in here. This is an area that should be protected. And when we were out there in October, that clearly the harvest plans had been approved, and the West for the consortium that manages cutting on Crown Land in Southwest Nova had come in and put this enormous logging road in. And this is something they've been doing. This is 30 meters from side to side, they're clearing. It's 2 kilometers long. It's basically a 6-hectare clear cut, which, by the way, doesn't count towards what they remove from the harvest plan areas. And we have reports of 40-meter wide roads. I mean, it's just a wood grab. But it's also quite devastating to one of the rarest things around, which is places with enough what's called interior forest habitat, where, you know, you don't have wind blowing in and sunlight and affecting the humidity levels, affecting the shade. It's really ecological vandalism. You know, it's not anything else. It's ecological vandalism. The road itself is 5.5 meters wide. I talked about this to DNRR about, we do ask them not to make it more than 20 meters wide. And the report I got back basically was that they wrapped the knuckles of the contractor. So there's no consequence to it. So needless to say, we felt pretty sick. But, you know, what are you going to do? You're going to turn your back on the clearing and go into the woods and start seeing what's there. This is another lichen hunter, Ashley, who's turned into a really amazing stubble lichen expert. Pretty quickly, we were into old forest, verging onto old growth forest that's certainly older than 8 years old. There are 2 patches on the west shore of Goldsmith Lake that are recognized by DNRR as old growth forest. Basically, it turns out that Bowater Mersey told them it was old growth. This land was all owned by the pulp and paper mill, Bowater Mersey. And when they went bankrupt, Nova Scotia taxpayers bought it back and thought that it was going to be conserved and looked after, and there would be a gentler hand on it. But it's really questionable whether West 4 has had a gentler hand. I don't think so. They leave 20-meter buffers. Bowater left 30-meter buffers along Watercourses, the water left some areas of old trees and they left legacy trees. So it's quite dismaying. So faced with all of that proposed logging, one of the things that we did in short order was put together a proposal to protect the area. I did this map. I thought everybody else was going to tell me what to do, but that's not really how these things work. But I was able to talk with John Leduc, who had been the head of the Protected Areas branch of the Department of Environment for many years and is credited with really having gotten protection going in Nova Scotia. He had already submitted a proposal to protect this area and Beals Brook and Big Lahade Lake and another area. He had written to the minister objecting strenuously to those logging proposals. None of it apparently made any difference. So what I was told is that you can put in a proposal to protect an area and it has no real force, but it's on fire. And it sort of has to be dealt with when somebody plans to go in and log. So better than nothing. Plus we had this commitment to protect 20%, which has not yet laid out any route for what that means. They have promised a plan to make a plan by the end of this year. But we'll see. But there's no real process. So we just said the heck with it and went ahead and put in this proposal to protect this and Beals Brook and Big Lahade. And did some documenting, but at this point we had found, this is November 10th, we submitted that we had found five species at risk by then, a blue felt lichen, a black ash, and 3 frosted glass whiskers. We'll get to them. So, lichen hunting. But also, this is Frances Anderson, who was a public librarian, and when she retired, she decided she would teach herself the lichens of Nova Scotia. And boy, did she. And she's co-written probably the most useful book for anyone out in the woods looking at lichens, called The Common Lichens of Northeastern North America, with Troy McMullen, who's a real lichen expert in Ottawa. So this is the frosted glass whisker that I just referred to. There are a number of species at risk lichens in Nova Scotia. At Last Hope, we found one of these and 14 black foam lichen, which is a much bigger and easier to find lichen. But that was one particular habitat. We found them all on red oak. It was a particular place. Here we have found not one single black foam lichen, but we have been finding these little tiny stubble lichen, and they really are about, not quite an 1/8 of an inch tall, and they grow inside on the rotting heartwood of yellow birch and red maples. I just bought myself a better headland because that's what you need. But I'm going to sort of move this out. Like, this is the listing that's at the federal level. So frosted glass whiskers, Scleroptera perenella. Tiny stubble lichen that is difficult to locate, restricted to mature or old growth hardwood forest, is very habitat specific, associated with very old forest. Habitat conditions for its occurrence are very rare on the landscape. Like other stubble lichens, it likely takes a long time to develop, and once disturbed will take a very long time to reestablish. So Brad Toms at MTRI says it's probably 100 years to reestablish. I mean, when they say slow, they mean slow. So when you start finding that in forests, it's telling you something. It also comes with a 100-meter buffer around it, which is approximately 7 acres. It's not anything to sneeze at. It also allows you, the thing about the lichens is, unlike species at risk like moose and birds, they don't move. Because basically DNRR will tell you about new members. Oh, they were just traveling through. The great thing about a lichen is that you go and you get its GPS and you record it and you report it to DNRR's wildlife division. It's not really disputable as long as it's confirmed. So they give us a little bit of leverage. They're also kind of media friendly. The media appears to love lichens. I'm not sure quite why, but they do. And so once we went public with, at this point, we had found 8 species at risk, and had put in the proposal to protect, and we put out a press release. We actually got CDC's Paul Palmer came out and interviewed, that's Lisa, on camera. It was an extremely cold day, November 25th, I think. That is worth a great deal when you're trying to get somewhere protected. It's remarkable how much more attention DNRR pays if the media is paying attention. I filed a Freedom of Information request for all of these harvest plans, and boy, is there ever a scurry of emails back and forth, and 8 people working on the response, and and I'll talk a little bit more about some of that response, but from our point of view, we just had to get on with finding more. But one of the things that also happened, and this is really probably another talk for another time, was that we got interested in other stubble lichens as well as the frosted grass whiskers. The stubble lichens, their other names, they're pilisioids. And somebody came across, one of us came across a paper that this guy in the bull cap, Steve Selva, had written that was really about how you might use surveys of stubble lichens to identify old growth forest, because they are a real measure of biodiversity. They're extremely specific as to what habitat they will grow on. So some particular ones grow on the tipped up roots of a tree. And Lisa's looked for a year and a half for one of those. Every single tip up she ever met in the woods, she went and looked at. And last week she found it for the first time. And this week she found a second one, both in the same kind of area. So, but they're big tip up roots. So they're very, very specific. And surveying them is a way to establish a level of biodiversity in an area. So going back to the old growth forest, the overarching reason to protect old growth forest is how much biodiversity it supports. It's not the number of big old trees. DNRR's method of identifying old growth forest is very dependent on the number of old trees, because they come at it from a forestry mindset. And they're not really looking at what that role is. So there's a bigger kind of scientific discussion that's going on, and not just from us, about this issue of how you identify ancient forests. And I think we're actually working on a paper about this. We have identified 4 kinds of stubble lichens that have never been identified in Nova Scotia before, including one named after this guy. So Steve Selva, that was first identified in 2018. Dr. Selva is the North American stubble lichen expert. And when we came across that paper, it turned out Francis Anderson had met him. And we said, well, maybe he would teach us how to do a stubble lichen survey. And she contacted him, and I think on a Friday. And he said, well, if you can cover my gas and give me somewhere to stay, I'm coming. And he got in his car in Portland, Maine, and was up here by Sunday. And spent 2 days in the woods with us, basically teaching us how to identify where to look for stubbles. He actually does most of the identification. He's sending samples because they're tiny and it's a very complex field. There are a few that we probably are close to reliably being able to identify. And certainly Francis can identify the frosted glass whiskers to the satisfaction of DNR. But it's It's the subject of another talk, and I would be very happy to come, or maybe Ashley, who has taken the most wonderful photographs and who's really been writing this article. It's way more interesting than it might sound at first. But it's one of the places where doing this work has led to completely unexpected areas of delight and interest and learning. And that's really, it's sometimes it's brutal, it's been cold, it's been long, it's been hard, sometimes it's depressing, but it's also been absolutely joyful getting out into the woods and doing this. So there's Lisa taking a sample of the stubble lichen in the snow. When I said that the DNR and Westfall were rather scrambling after we got the CBC coverage, this is Westfall sent DNR the draft of their op-ed that they were going to put in the Chronicle Herald to counter the publicity that we were getting for Goldsmith Lake. These 10,000 acres of crown land have been painted in the media as old, untouched pieces of forest that should be protected because of these qualities. We thought it would be important for the public to know this is just not true. And they then said that it had all been cut over in 1975 to 1976, and then, sprayed and so on and so forth. And, it's just not true. So they're out there going, oh, no, it's all been messed around too much to be worth protecting. So a chunk of what we're doing is going, well, that's not the case. And so finding the species of risk lichens is a very good way of establishing that, no, this is an area that is actually special. So one of the things we do is map them. That black line is where they put that new logging road in. And as you see, it actually cuts into the buffer of at least, there's two together actually in the buffer that it cuts into the frosted ghost whiskies. So whether they will survive the kind of wind that's blasting down that road or not, we don't know. I mean, they didn't know they were there, but why didn't they know they were there? Well, because DNR doesn't actually go out and really look. They rely on their old maps, and they rely on their interpretation of satellite maps, and they rely on these permanent sample plots that aren't here. It's not a very impressive way of doing things. In this map, you'll see that the areas of old growth that are recognized that I mentioned, these were what were recognized when we first started looking here, those two red areas. So as an example of this mapping issue, that peninsula that comes up into the lake that divides the two arms of the lake, the pale green is early mature forest. They've changed the age, but it's now like 40 to 80 years old. So it's younger than 80 is their assessment of it. And that's part of what Westfall is talking about when they say, oh no, it's all been cut over. Because indeed, I got to see on a Freedom of Information that a Bowater map for that shows it all having been clear cut in 71, 72. So there's a drone shot view of it. And as you can see, there's a hardwood stand along the eastern side of the peninsula. I had also worked with a grad student at COGS, the Center of Geographic Sciences. He said, there's a much taller stand of trees through there. So at some point I was kayaking with my wife and came up close to it and saw big hemlocks by the side of the water and also big ones through the trees. And we thought, we better get back there. So we did. And what we found were enormous hemlocks. I mean, the largest is 97 centimeters diameter at breast height, which is pretty humongous. So those were growing on the flat between the lake and a slope. And then there was the hardwood slope you saw in the drone with very large and ancient yellow birch. So it's a 4.2 hectares, so about 10 acres of the yellow birch stand, right where they were showing only forests younger than 80. this place that's not worth protecting. So we began the easiest way to get there is kayaks, and fortunately we started in August, and it was incredibly pleasant. And we just started really exploring what was there. That's Francis Anderson, the lichen person standing. The lichen on the left is called Annapolis County, and it's not a species at risk lichen, but it's a lichen that anybody who's hunting for lichens goes, ooh, if you see that, because it really tells you you're in very good moist old forest type habitat, and we were finding quite a lot of it. And the shot on the right is actually the largest amount of frosted glass whiskers we've ever seen. If you peer at the pale stripe of it down towards the bottom, you might be able to see the kind of stubbliness, the little tiny. That's the frosted glass whiskers growing on a very large red maple. The other lichen that we found that was interesting, and is actually the only lichen that the Department of Natural Resources and Renewables treats as part of their growth assessment, is the coral lichen that you see a close-up of on the right. And it's quite distinctive. That's probably why they include it, because it's relatively easy to identify. But it's not very common. It grows both on rocks, especially rocks right by the water, and primarily on hemlocks, including in very old hemlock forests. It grows in great profusion. But it also, we found it growing probably for the first time on yellow birch. So drawing on yet more expertise, this is Donna Crossland, who some of you may know for her current efforts to protect hemlocks. But she and I went out with an instrument borer to get some ages. So we took from a small hemlock, not, 53.75 centimeter DDH, not the great big 97, and got 276 years. And that was dead-eyed on it. It's a straight shot right to the core of the tree. It was kind of amazing. The yellow birch, most yellow birch are hollow in the middle. It doesn't really compromise them. They keep on growing, but it makes it darn difficult to get increment borer samples because you run the risk of not being able to get the borer back out. It was a trick, but basically we took the cores for half of the radius of the tree, so the actual age is pretty reliably going to be double what's there. So those were 350-year-old yellow birch. At which point I contacted Peter Bush at DNRR and said, could you go out and look at that hardwood slope? Could you send somebody out to assess it? And also, could you look at the hemlocks along the basin? There's a particular motive for this, which is the Department of Environment is responsible for protecting the hemlocks against the woolly adelgid. As many of you probably know, they can now be inoculated. And it's kind of a holding thing while we wait to see whether natural predators will take over. But without it, basically, they're going to die. These are not badly infested yet, but a couple of them, you could see that the tops were beginning to thin. So they really need to be treated if possible. DNR forgot that I asked them to look at those stands, even though they must have pretty much hiked past them, and instead they assessed and found old growth in the 4.2 hardwood stand, the one that's outlined in red, is now officially old growth. And then for reasons which completely escaped me, they decided to check the stand sort of to the north and west of it, which only shows us having 9-meter tall trees as opposed to the hemlocks which have 17 meters. So it's incredibly frustrating because the Department of Environment won't treat trees on Crown land unless they're protected, because why? They don't trust the Department of Natural Resources and Renewables not to go in and cut them down later or allow somebody to do that. So we had this weird position. We're in discussions Peter Bush says they'll get somebody back out, but we mapped a whole lot of the hemlocks. And there isn't time now to go into the absurdities of the old growth policy, but suffice to say that it does not seem to be designed to actually find old growth forests. It seems to be quite well designed to quite often not find them. But as you can see, we found a couple more frosted glass whispers, and with their buffers, they do provide some protection, and we'll see what happens. So here's where we are now. Well, as of 5 days ago, we're up to 26 species at risk, 2 more that haven't been confirmed yet, and we've got them in almost all the areas that they're planning on logging. Now, back last March, it looked as if they were getting going. And I had some rather urgent conversations with DNRR, who then told us that actually all the logging, the harvest areas where we had found species at risk were on hold. And to the best of my knowledge, that remains true. But it's just a hold. They can take it off anytime they want. And they're extraordinarily bad at communicating anything. So you probably don't remember it, but the earlier maps, those red patches of old growth were quite a bit smaller. They did get expanded. I had asked them to go check it. They said, oh yeah, we could send somebody out. But it turned out they'd actually expanded it, 4 months earlier, but they didn't feel required to say. So clearly we have a lot of work to do in the Goldsmith Wilderness Area, and finding individual specimens of lichens is not the best way to go about deciding to protect an area. It's extraordinarily labor intensive. Our hope when they said they were putting those areas on hold was that they would begin to treat individual occurrences as an indication of a habitat we should protect, right? And they sort of talked as if that was what was on the table, but when I got the freedom of information, it doesn't show up anywhere in any of their emails. Sorry. And we also now know that there's probably clear-cutting plan for that area under the high production forestry. So the fight goes on. A pretty big chunk of all this is getting public attention, media attention, making sure people know about it, making sure people are talking to their MLAs. It's all the stuff that lots of us would rather be in the woods looking for lichens. And I have to say that personally, the thing that keeps me going is actually the trips into the woods and spending that time and being with people who, you hear just joyously exclaim through the woods when they find something. Because dealing with the politicians is largely not very much fun, and dealing with DNRR is even less. So I'm going to just kind of very quickly skip out to where we are now with the Save Old Forest petitions. As you can see, tabled in 2, we actually thought Lunenburg had 2, but the MLA who said she was going to do it mysteriously didn't do it. So, but our goal is really to have every county submit, table, file a petition, making exactly the same ask per county. So this is the one for Halifax. That petition is there. We're not asking people to go knocking door to door, but if you're up for taking a petition and just getting your friends to sign, or going into the local coffee shop and asking them to put that petition, every bit of this helps. Because we really, without people's engagement, there's no real way that we're going to protect old forests. The forces of the forestry industry, the grip they have, the kind of corporate capture. I'm generally an optimistic person, but I have to tell you, the more I do this, the more I think, hey, this is pretty dreadful on the inside, but they are very clearly responsive to people paying attention, people asking, people pushing. So we tried to have things that are not too hard to do. And as I said at the beginning, ways for people to do stuff they already love to do. So we've had an art show and a music festival and poetry readings, and people donate and people come up with other ways to support. Whatever they are, it shouldn't be beautiful and miserable. It should be like going out into the woods for those of us who like doing it. Because this is something we can do that makes a difference in what feels like a very overwhelming and difficult world and time. But the element probably of the Sea campaign that's really close to my heart is the hope that other counties are going to also do what we've been doing with Goldsmith. Find somewhere, somebody already knows about areas of old forest on Crown land that should be protected. You know, and I'm sure this society has people in it who know. And so get together and start doing it. We're very happy to help. I'm happy. The rest of our small group of organizers is very happy to help figuring out mapping and strategies and connection with people who can help with lichen hunting and all of those things. It's a very good for one's heart way to come together with people to do that kind of work. And even if it's just coming on a workshop and learning to identify trees in winter, which is what we did 2 weekends ago. And yesterday we just introduced people to Goldsmith Lake and took people out on a hike, and actually ended up finding another patch of what I'm pretty sure is old growth forest. With the biggest tree we had yet identified, we didn't have our DBH tape, but my wingspan is the equivalent of 50 centimeters of DBH, and I couldn't reach around it with both twice. So, ways to be in contact, I'll leave that up and just take questions if you have any. Anyone?
Yes, I have a question. There was one talk I went to a few months ago that apparently a lot of land is owned by private landowners.
Right. Have to turn up the audio so you can hear. Okay, any questions from the Zoom audience, sir?
Yes. A talk I was at a few months ago, apparently a lot of the land is owned by private landowners. And according to that talk, some of that is old growth and some of them don't intend to do any clear cutting or do anything with it. So I'm not exactly a landowner. I've got 5 acres. I've got trees that are certainly over 100 years old. I'm just wondering if anything can be done, not just with the Crown land, but also with private land.
That's a really good and perplexing question. As long as the land is owned, as long as the private land is owned by somebody who cares about it, okay. But how does somebody put their land in some level of protection so that when they die, for example, it cannot be clear cut? Like my wife and I own 125 acres, and we have that question. There are some groups in Nova Scotia. Working Woodland Trust is being stalled by the government in getting its community easement approval, but it's on its way. That's definitely a good starting point. You know, land can be donated to the Nature Trust, but that generally has to be a pretty good chunk of land or connected to another piece. There are costs to conserving that make this a bit difficult. I should also just say that there is no automatic protection for old growth forest on private land, and species at risk on private land are not protected. They're not given those 100-meter buffers. So,
there is some kind of organization for private landowners, isn't there? I think something was mentioned in this talk.
There are an awful lot of organizations, some of which are much worse than others.
Okay.
So I recommend looking into the Nova Scotia Working Woodland Trust. It's the Medway Community Forest Cooperative is connected to them, and they're a reputable outfit. I don't think I've got much more helpful to say about private land.
Because when I first had to start dealing with my small area, I did approach the Department of Natural Resources, I think, and they could, at one time, they could come out and help us, but I was informed, this was a few years ago, that they just don't have the manpower to help out people with small lots.
I think that's all that's the most knowledge I have to put into that. I'm sorry, Carol. David Patrick has a chat question. The date for submitting the petition, yes, March 31st is the Halifax County petition, and for most of the ones that we're getting rolling right now. Any other? I see a question from the floor.
There was an article in the Herald, in the Chronicle Herald, a couple of weeks ago, and it was really an ad for the forest industry. You see that? How do you counter that? There's also the propaganda.
So the question is, there was a recent piece of forest industry propaganda in the Chronicle Herald. How do we counter that? Yes, I read that and was sort of appalled. I'm not sure that anybody pulled it together to respond directly in comments, which is a good thing to do if you're a subscriber. But it was a ridiculous piece, which once again peddled the idea that cutting and planting forests is just like planting a cornfield and then harvesting it. You know, which sort of is like, okay, I thought corn was an annual crop. And we won't even mention what actually has happened to agricultural land as a result of poor farming practices. But it's an endless thing. I think there's a few of us who are working on putting together a kind of response, because right now Forest Nova Scotia has also come out and said, oh my goodness, this plan to protect 20%, you know, it's going to make wildfires much, much worse. And you need to let us go into all the protected areas and thin those forests. And, you know, there's a study in Nordic countries that shows they don't have as many wildfires as we do, and it's because they thin. And if you look at the study, that's not the case. Anyway, it's an endless push and pull. And we just have to work on getting more accurate information out there. And actually, David Patrick's Nova Scotia Forest Notes has a very good takedown of some sort of discussion of the latest Forest Nova Scotia propaganda. I saw another hand, Ben.
How does the
Oh, you have to, well, once you report the species at risk and they confirm it, actually, once you report it, they sort of temporarily put that buffer on and confirm it. And sometimes that involves somebody coming out and doing a lichen survey. That's what happened at Last Hope. Sometimes now they kind of recognize that we're not playing games, and they will let Francis Anderson confirm. But basically, you report it to biodiversity@novascotia.ca. We also always report it to the Atlantic Canada Conservation Data Center. You need to do it to the first two, because the ACCDC, according to DNRR, they only share the information twice a year, so it's not a speedy way to do it. You want to also do it to biodiversity, and at that point, I think they used to play more games, and they're getting a little bit better, but who knows? Anyway, it's very worth being on top of following up and saying, did you get my report? Is there, you know? Yeah. I saw David's hand here.
Yeah, Nina. Oh, just what a wonderful overview of the whole situation. It's just really incredible, and everything you've done with lichens, and certainly the wildflora folks know how hard lichen identification can seem to be. So I think that might encourage us all to be a bit more of a go at it. I've taken a couple of classes and haven't graduated yet. Anyway, what I wanted to ask you was, how common is the pit and mound topography in those old forests?
So David's question is, how common is the pit and mound topography in those old forests? It was very present where we were yesterday, up on the hardwood sort of hilltop. It's hard to identify always in other areas at Goldsmith because of how many erratics there are. It's such a rocky landscape.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, but otherwise, I think it's really, important when we see pits and mounds to record where they are, because that indicates a long continuity, at least in terms of the soil.
Okay.
Yeah, and I just thought, we were talking about the high production forestry. If you remember, I found that it's already plotted the maps there, and I did a calculation for the area of Goldsmith Lake, and it actually comes out to 25% of the crown land there is identified as possible high plantation forestry. So just like, oh my, sorry, I don't want to be discouraging, but
did everybody hear that? Or should
let's just say it's supposed to be under 10%, but then where do they draw that, at the whole province level, or but functionally, I mean, 25% just high production. Plus, as you say, even the extensive forestry involves road building and disturbance and so on. It's pretty upsetting. Yeah, so I'm just really happy you're kind of taking a grab at that whole area, and I hope we can hang on to it.
I do too. I do too. It was the people on Zoom, if I'm not sure if you heard that, but it was a sort of a comment about how important the role of CBC is and how we're going to need to pay attention to that in the upcoming election. And absolutely no question about that. Incredibly important, but also in the time that I've been trying to protect these forests, which has been pretty kind of focused since 2019. In 2019, we still had a local journalist with Saltwire who did the most wonderful, detailed, accurate, careful coverage of what was happening at the Corbett Dalhousie Lake, which is sort of in the eastern side of the area we're trying to protect. And the loss of that coverage is devastating. It's incredibly difficult to get the word out, just locally, let alone across the province. And it's a real question how, Forest Nova Scotia has a huge budget, and they can pay for big ads and they can pay for this stuff. And they've got a communications consultant who contacts DNR. And in fact, Forest Nova Scotia recently told a group they were addressing, maple sugar producers up in Cape Breton, that they've met with the Minister of the Environment 4 times in the last month. Well, I can tell you right now that the Minister of Environment, like the Minister of Natural Resources and Renewables, is not meeting with environmental groups. It's staggeringly difficult to get any kind of access. And without media also covering that, we're really in trouble. So I completely endorse your point of the importance of that. Any other? Oops, yes, I see hands. Okay, I'm not sure who went up first. Carol, was it?
I think I've already talked too much, but anyway. You mentioned, of course, all of us. I'm in an area where all of us have large lots, big trees, some of them down. You talked about. We're all concerned, of course, about the possibility of fire, of burning. I think you mentioned that this is not a concern, did you say, in the Swedish forests?
So did folks hear that? Is the question whether I had said that fire was not a concern in the Swedish model? That's not what I said. What I said
Oh,
is
sorry.
that as far as Nova Scotia is claiming, there's a study out of Scandinavia
Yeah.
showing that their incredibly overmanaged forests are not as prone to fire. And it's not what the study actually shows. I think when you're talking about forests right around houses, or what's called the urban forest interface or the urban nature interface, that's a different question than when you're talking about large areas of the forest that are not right up against human habitation. So there are some different questions for that. In a general way, in Nova Scotia, we have an incredibly humid climate. I mean, of course, we had that drought in April, but basically trees, especially once they're on the ground, you know, they get soggy and mossy pretty quickly. They're not out there burning fast. And the forest industry is really quite busy trying to cash in on people's anxieties, but I'm not going to pretend to be an expert about this because I'm really not. David actually knows a little more than I do, and I see his hand is up, so maybe he can bail me out.
Oh, sorry, my hand, I'm inept at using this thing. I didn't take it down, but that Nordic study, I mean, it's ridiculous. The reason they got less fires because there's more roads in there to put out the fires. So it's not but the nature of the forest, it's that they've got so many roads, and because they want to keep their forests for, you know, logging and so on, they put them out quickly. I mean, Forest Nova Scotia, either they don't have anybody seriously reading the literature, or they're just deliberately misleading people. It's anyway. I'm sorry. Something else you wanted me to comment on?
If you had other thoughts about that urban forest.
Oh yeah, I mean, again, they completely misused that because they've taken the idea that you know, they'll say, well, Parks Canada is thinning their forest. Yes, they're thinning their forest close to the structures, but they're not going in and blanket thinning the forest. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of, you know, it's just, anyway, I wrote a piece on it on one of my blogs, and when you go through what they say and look at the picture, it just doesn't match up, and it's fear mongering. It's really atrocious.
Yep.
The other point, David, you might want to comment on is the burn that we saw down by Upper Tantallon. You identified as being mostly young coniferous trees. So, you know, in terms of the fear of fire in these old growth forests, I think, you want to comment on, you know, just where these fires are?
Example of their tactics, because they're aware of the sort of generalization that broadleaves can stop forests and that they're much less flammable. So they come out on this, you know, they have a blog, and they came out about, I can't remember the title of it, but anyway, one of the points they tried to counter was that people say that hardwoods don't burn, but there was a lot of hardwood that burned in these fires. But in fact, when you go in and look at the vegetation maps for the areas, it's predominantly softwoods. And Ellen Whitman, who's really kind of recognized now as Canada's national forest fire expert, and who knows this area because she spent time down here, she said these were conifers and forest plantation, you know, forested managed lands that burned. So it's just, you know, we have to be careful. We really have to counter those. That's why I wrote that piece. Mm-hmm. We really have to counter the things they're saying, because they just come out and make these blanket statements that cater to people's fears, you know. And what I'm concerned about is that they have the ear of government. That's what I mentioned. You know, we can't talk to government. They won't even reply to your emails. But these people have the ear of government, and you know, they may just come out with something that says, oh yeah, we're going to do, you know, allow thinning in some of the protected areas, you know, because Forest Nova Scotia says we need to do that to reduce fires. I mean, that was so ill thought out that I don't think they thought about that, because what they say is that we need access to forests where logging isn't allowed. I don't think they realize that it also includes private lands. Some of their big supporters, you know, when they say that, they say we need access to forests where we're not allowed to harvest. Well, that also includes private lands. And if anybody doesn't want, you know, heavy hands going into private lands, it's Shore Forest, Nova Scotia. Anyway, I'm sorry.
Thank you, David. And is that it for questions? Looks like it. So thank you very much for your time and listening. And please, if you can, take a petition, sign up, come and sign up for emails if you're interested from the Arlington Forest Protection Society.ca. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Nina. That was wonderful. Want to say a few words, Charlie?
Yeah. Nature Nova Scotia also has a very good article on their website on forests. And Bob Bancroft has sent letters to government regards the state of our forests. And, tried to bend their ear a little bit, but you know, tried to get them to listen. That's it for tonight. So thank you very much, everybody. And,
Okay, good night all.
good night.